So one of the issues we've got with regard to creating equity is we are fundamentally different, both sexually, racially, and regionally. And what is equity? How do you create balance when we are individually very different, and we have differences that grab it, that differentiate us by groups based on belief, groups based on religion, pretty much the same thing actually. Groups based on sexual orientation, sex. The number of differences is fast exceeding the similarities. In fact, we know full well now that we're able to do MRI scans and then code an AI to interpret what the brain is thinking, that we all think pretty much differently. At least so far in the MRI testing, they haven't found any two people whose brain works the same way, which means you have to build the model from scratch in every individual, which makes it a relatively poor method for as a lie detector. Incredibly accurate if you can get it to work. Incredibly problematic because the programming time is excessive, and you certainly could imagine somebody being using this particular form of technology as a lie detector, probably being against training machines so it would be effective in such a role. So when you've got those level of differences, creating equity between parties is, as an absolute, is undoubtedly impossible. We were born different. On the other hand, you can certainly move to remove artificial differentiations, beliefs that certain races are inferior, beliefs that certain sexes are inferior. That structure is outdated and to a large extent has been proven categorically false. You may be different than the person next to you, but the differences you have with the person next to you probably has more to do with their genetics than their race or their sex. If your parents were absolutely brilliant, there's a good chance you're going to be absolutely brilliant. Probably decent odds. And if not, perhaps not. Though there are certainly evidence that people have come from relatively mundane parents and grown to be extremely capable in their individual fields. And that does showcase that a couple things. One is the genetic limitations may not be absolute, and the other is that the nature and type of upbringing a child has probably has more to do with what they're capable of doing than at least some aspect of their genetics. And so you've got differing elements, and that means early on you kind of need to do an assessment of just what the natural capabilities of a child are, what their proclivities are, what are the things they'll do well in, what are the things they'll do poorly in, and perhaps guide them towards a path that better encompasses what they're going to do well. And I think this particular step should take out any preconceived notions of race, sex, at least race or sex, and perhaps even region. We've had some brilliant minds come out of developing countries, but it really comes back down to what were the experiences they had as a child growing up, and how were they able to turn those experiences into some type of performance, job performance. So you walk into a company or a country the way it is right now, where you have poor equity. You have a lot of you've got an elite structure. You've got a belief structure that says this particular race is going to be smarter than another, or this particular sex is going to be smarter than another. To fix the underlying problem, you have to counter-educate, and that means what you've got to do is you have to deprogram the system so that it no longer makes false conclusions based on those particular metrics, and change it over into a system that makes conclusions based on capabilities, competence, and inherent strengths. That's not easy, and you could certainly look over into some of the Scandinavian countries and say that they're close to being right. I mean, they don't seem to have as many difficulties as some of the other Western nations do, but I don't think we can point to any particular region as being perfect. Singapore tries to be perfect, tries very hard, But then if you look at the underlying dynamic, you don't see a heck of a lot of diversity. And so one of the reasons why I think maybe the system's working quite as well as it is because they haven't had to deal with a diversity program the way that some other countries have had to deal with it. Doesn't mean it's flawed or incorrect. It just means perhaps their path was easier because there was one element they didn't have to deal with. So in the end, when you're trying to deal with a very complex and difficult problem like this, your best method is the scientific method, which means you break it down into component parts, and you can't deal with the problem as a whole. You can only deal with the problem in components in areas that you can wrap your arms around it and work against. And that means that you start in education. You make sure that education is offered fairly to everybody, and then people are allowed and encouraged to rise to their individual competence. And part of how we need to showcase this is to a certain extent we need to stop promoting certain job types like they're the greatest thing for everyone. CEOs, for instance, there are only a small number of people that are good at being CEOs. It is a very unique skill set. And we do a lousy job of training into it, which is why we have so many CEOs that miss out. Yet we hold that job up as the thing that everybody should want to strive for. You want to be the person that runs the company. But what if you have crappy leadership skills? What if you're much better as an individual contributor than a manager? Well, that should be encouraged. Your individual contribution should be encouraged. Now, mature companies like, say, IBM have parallel path programs that allow folks to advance as an individual contributor, much like they would advance up through management. And that allows people to reach their optimum. But what if their optimum, and we'll go back to the Peter Principle. The Peter Principle is the idea that you rise to your level of competence. I believe the principle is real because I've observed it enough times. But you look at that and say, you want to stop the person before they reach that particular point, as opposed to pushing them to that point of incompetence and then terminating them when they can't do the job, which seems completely idiotic in hindsight. You take a resource that you've built over the years, you make a decision to move them up. They don't handle that particular move up, and so you terminate them. And it's particularly tough for women because typically when women move up in an organization, people already believe they're not capable of doing the job, and so they're simply looking for reasons to find fault. And women often approach a problem, particularly management, very different than men. And that difference isn't worse, it's just different. In many ways, and Google found this in their own studies, women that weren't engineers were better at managing engineers than men that were engineers, which I thought was fascinating and a piece of work that I think should have been spread more widely. But it would indicate that managers often don't need as a core capability the same kind of strength that their subordinates do. They need to understand the topic. They need to understand how the job is done. But for the most part, a manager is supposed to optimize the people that work underneath them. Yet, if you bring somebody up through a department into management, and in the department, their motivations were all focused on making themselves look as good as possible, standing out against their peers so that they advance, and you make them a manager, it's very often the case that the manager then is hostile to their employees because he or she views those employees as threats. And that creates real problems. Then you have a lack of equity within the department about people that the manager likes that doesn't view as threats, and outperformance the manager does view as threats and tries to put down. I had one manager I worked for that was particularly hostile to smart women. And we kind of knew he was being hostile to smart women because these women who he underrated for the entire time I watched him, as soon as they were outside of his department, just blossomed and went vertical, so indicating that they were being held back, largely because of their sex and his belief that they just couldn't be performant. It was a false belief, but then it's the goal of upper management to identify that and correct it. And really, there are very few programs that allow for that underlying mechanism. In terms of creating equity, the department and the company that's supposed to do that is human resources. But unfortunately, the human resources department, in terms of the United States, converted from being an employee help function to being a compliance function back in the 1970s. And so for the most part, it's been accused of covering up the misacts of managers as opposed to really helping employees advance. And the upswing in unions in the United States in technical fields is largely the result of that. HR is not doing its job, so employees are organizing to get the job done more properly. But unions aren't known for equity either. The difficulty is they've got one tool, that's strike, and it's like walking into a medical arena where you have to do surgery, and the only tool you've got is an axe. It's just not going to end well for the patients, and so the unions are not capable. They don't have the tools associated with their profession that allows them to deal with things like equity. They can deal with the population and labor as a mass, but dealing with individual problems is problematic. Yes, you have a shop foreman, you have people that you can go to and complain, but the shop foreman still falls back on the only thing that they can really use is this nuclear option, where if enough people are abused, then the shop foreman can call for a general strike, and the company gets punished. But it's simply too severe. So if you want to drive equity, first it has to start with undoing the misconceptions of the past, and then you have to have a working mechanism that assures, as close as you can, that people are treated fairly and equitably during the time of work, whether it's in education, private industry, or government. And honestly, I've covered this. I've got a degree in it, and yet I have yet to point out since the early work that I did over I saw done over at Rome Systems, which became a subsidiary of IBM, that had a great place to work department, where you were actually able to focus on the individual things that were creating problems in the company and lowering the overall performance of the individuals. And I think until we actually wrap our heads around this and rethink human resources, we're going to have a period of time we're getting to equity. I think that right now the market, the average person, believes very strongly in equity, but it hasn't migrated over into corporate policy to assure that the way that we're managing equity is in fact equitable, and we're still kind of using tools that have been either perverted in HR or misdesigned in terms of unions to deal with a problem that is very surgical in nature and requires a depth of understanding of the employee and the related complaints that we just don't have. As head of internal audit for a period of time for at least field audit, I was the auditor in charge for the field. In IBM, I observed an awful lot of stuff that was improper. And here was a company that is still rated as one of the most equitable companies on the planet, and they still had severe problems with regard to management and disparities in terms of people. Mostly, as I came up, it was between women and men, but clearly there were racial differences that might occur in some of the divisions in other parts of the country than where I was. So in the end, I believe there's a way to fix this, but it's going to require a methodological approach. I'm not sure I pronounce that right. And it needs to start early, and it needs to go from the beginning as kids come up, so that they understand the need and the mechanism to achieve equity, and then move into companies where there is a functional focus, where equity and inclusion becomes their predominant goal, and they have both the responsibility to achieve it and the authority to make it happen. Chief diversity officers are the function currently in place that are designed to do this, but why they aren't working and why they are now falling into they're in decline. Why they're falling into decline is because you gave them the responsibility without the authority, and that's similar to what we did with risk managers about a decade ago. And when you give somebody the authority rather than the responsibility rather than the authority, they just become blame magnets. And quickly people don't want the job, and it doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't do you any good to have somebody in the sideline going, hey, it's wrong. If they can't fix it, everybody just kind of ignores them and says, hey, that's your job. If it's your problem, maybe perhaps you should fix it. It's not the way it works. So it's got to be both the authority and the responsibility has to flow together. And until the problem is corrected, the focus really needs to be from the beginning to the end to assure an equitable environment. And I'll pass the hat to whoever is going to go next. Good morning.
Mr. David. Mr. David.
Rob, excellent comments, and thank you so much. Sharif, Thank you. I mean, let me just pull back just a second and get into a couple of definitional things to make sure we're all on the same page. Uh, Social equity, if you look at how it tends to be defined by multiple people, it's the fair, just, and equitable management of all institutions serving the public directly or by contract, and the fair and equitable distribution of public services and the implementation of public services, and the commitment to promote fairness, justice, and equity in the formation of public policy. And many of the elements that Rob were talking about are very, very important as you get into that and the understanding of that. And social policy, which is a big part of social equity, must include a variety of contexts. And it's not just limited to education, policing, welfare, housing, transportation. And it also means you have to recognize planning practices that have adverse or disparate impacts on certain communities and work to see how to put them. And if you begin to hear what some others says, for example, the American Planning Association says social equity must be informed by local planning history, the equity landscape, and the input of very diverse stakeholders in order to be successful. And it really goes beyond that to planning practices and actively working with the effective citizens and residents and companies to create better communities for all. And some of the major segments of social equity is gentrification, environmental justice, and community engagement empowerment. But oftentimes we get confused of some of these. Social equity and social equality are pretty close, but they're slightly different. The term equity refers to fairness and justice, and the term equality refers to equal opportunity, equal access, equal treatment, equal sharing, and division of the resources, keeping everyone at the same levels regardless of the tools they have, their accesses, their history, and everything. Social equity, though, recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates and promotes the resources and opportunities needed to reach the outcomes. And it means social equality, though, means each individual is given the same resources or opportunities. So there are very differences, but big differences between them. And you can begin to see how they're used and how they're put in place. The World Economic Forum, the United Nations, recently had a meeting this year under the theme of Cooperation in a Fragmented World at Davos. And this was a big part of that meeting there. And some of their key outcomes of it is they believe that the equity must include gender parity for economic recovery, innovation for social fairness, enabling transformations and transitionings, and looking at the rights and capabilities of everyone and every sex, every race, and the equality is there. An interesting statistic out there is, and I will try to get through very fast. Out of this Davos meeting, they said it would take 132 years to reach gender parity, and that 160 million people were pushed into deeper poverty and really out of a view of social equity by the pandemic. They estimated that it was going to take $28 trillion of GDP to close the global gender gap just by itself. And I mean, just tremendous figures going back and forth on this. And we're seeing that there's many places which are trying to take action on it. For example, the Edison Alliance for Digital Inclusion begin to say that they have already had an impact in the lives of 454 million people in 90 countries, with over 250 initiatives that are directly related to the whole area of society and equity. And we see that as a big trend that is increasing. In the United States, last week, some action was taken in the presidential administration trying to put more funds to address this in the United States by itself. When I begin to look at the developing world and read some of the reports, I see increased emphasis of this in the developing world. The place where we need to also make sure this applies is as we go back and look at higher education in both the developing and the developed world. There are places where this is not treated at all. In fact, part of higher education encourages the opposite. And we need to stop rewarding the folks who go the other way. And as Rob said, is begin to focus what is needed to do these things. And we can take best practices from the commercial industry. We can take best practices from other places and begin to collect them and spread them globally, and begin to have an impact in this area. And it's one that we really need to begin to put some of this type of focus in, because it all is around the ideas of justice and fairness, and how, as the governments, as the corporations, as academia begin to look at the customers of theirs, the staff, the users, they need to understand that this is an important topic that impacts all of them, and that we have to go ahead and put our plans in place to bring the appropriate actions, bring the appropriate education to bear. As in many of the topics on your program, Dr. Shreve, education is a huge part of this. And education needs to be brought around that is consistent across all the various stakeholders, that's consistent across the ecosystems, and that highlight and re-educate where necessary the impacts from this. As Rob said in his opening remarks, sometimes it's just one individual that can cause significant differences, and that when others are removed from that, they blossom and rise to the top. This is a place where that same capabilities are promoted across this whole diverse stakeholder group. And Dr. Shreve, that's part of the reason why I think this is a topic that I appreciate you choosing for today. So thank you, Dr. Shreve.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Donald.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think that it's very important what David mentioned about the difference between equity and equality. However, in some senses, they sort of overlap, because when you look at something like the question of fairness and justice, it's something that is not something that you can objectively measure and everybody can agree on. What's fair and just according to one person is going to be not be fair and just according to another person. Some people get their rules for justice out of old books of mythology, like the Bible and things like that, and they actually they think that the society is most fair if they follow the rules from ancient mythology. And then other people, I love the idea that if somebody thinks of what they'd like society to be like if they were born one of the poorest person in that society, like just it's a person named John Rawls, who's a very well-regarded person when you think about ethics. And so, think about that for a second. You're born into this society and you're in the lowest rungs of that society. What would you like that society to be like? How would you like, what does it mean to be equitable? If you're born poor and a person of color in the United States, what's the relationship that you have to equity with Bill Gates or Elon Musk or whoever like that? There's obviously no relationship whatsoever. I mean, right now we have a presidential candidate who's been arrested for 3 different things so far, and he's about to be arrested for a 4th. And he has no consequences. He just goes out and runs for president, does whatever he wants. They tell him not to say certain things and he just ignores them and says them, and he has absolutely no consequences for it. And so if I did that, the judge would kick my ass instantly. I mean, when you go into the court, it's Your Honor, yes, right, thank you so much. That's the way you have to act. You can't just blow them off. And so it's very, very obvious that the equity of justice and equity in all kinds of ways it's almost like it's not a goal in the United States and other places in the world. And part of the reason for that is that we have this kind of like a fundamental presupposition about the idea of merit. And we have this fundamental presupposition that people who rise to the top because they're better than everyone else. And it's both a kind of rational view, but it's also a highly religious view, which is due to our Calvinist Protestant roots in the United States. We have the idea of grace, which is that a person who does well because God likes them better than everyone else. And so there's a wonderful book about it that I'm sure everyone has heard of, or many people have read, called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by the sociologist Max Weber, where he explains this in some detail. However, so what I'm really getting at is that we're not equitable at all. There's 27,000 people who donate 25% of the money to election campaigns. So there's literally 27,000 people that are buying the politicians and controlling our country. And that's, for me, that doesn't make, it's not equitable. It's not fair. It's not reasonable, but we don't do anything about it. I want to contrast this to Finland, where in Finland, they are very careful to try and make things be egalitarian. So their tax rate is very, it's graded. The more money you make, the higher taxes you pay. Where in the United States, it used to be that way, but it's been, there's been, those 27,000 people have been working there, spending their money and working very, very hard to make it so that we don't have that kind of a tax system anymore. And it's been being successful. And so how would you measure and decide if people felt that the country they live in was just and fair and equitable? I think that measuring happiness is a pretty good indicator, like how happy are people with their government, their lives, and things like that. And so when you look at that, the countries that are most happy with their lives and are also the countries that are most equitable economically, and they're equitable by justice. For instance, in Finland, if you're very, very wealthy and you get a traffic ticket, they grade it relative to your wealth. So like if I get a traffic ticket for $500, it hurts. But if Bill Gates gets a traffic ticket for $500, it's like, I mean, he could get the money out of the change that's fallen out of people's pockets in his couches. I mean, that's nothing to him. So in Finland, what they do is people like Bill Gates will get a traffic ticket for $50,000 or $500,000 or some amount of money so that it actually has some sort of impact on him, at least psychologically. And those are the kinds of things that you can actually do that make things more equitable and fair. Now, I'm going to finish this off by saying something fundamentally, which is that our country, for purposes of the Cold War, during the after World War II, came up with this kind of theory that's usually referred to now as neoclassical economics. And it's this theory that you can measure economic activity by rational choice and preferences, and it's flat wrong. It's not. It got us into a position where the only way we can measure the success of a CEO is how much money they make, and we don't have the basically mindset and tools to try and become more equitable, partially because of our society. Like when we say somebody, it's merit, like somebody goes to Harvard and they get a degree at Harvard Law School, we think, wow, that's because they're just smarter and better than everyone else. But if you look at it, 25%, 30% of the people who go to Harvard are legacy. Their parents went to Harvard, and they're white, and by and large, and they're also wealthy, because the number one predictor of getting into Harvard is how much money your parents have. That's it. I mean, that it's been shown. So even for things like education and your access to resources, you can't just let the free market make that happen, because it doesn't work. And so that's why when countries like Finland and Norway and Denmark and things like that they're not against the free market. They consider markets. They consider themselves capitalist countries. They don't consider themselves socialists. But it's capitalism with guardrails. It's capitalism with looking at the things about it that don't work very well and addressing those problems and trying to create a situation where things are equitable and people can be happy. And I think that there's models of both failure of this and models of success at this. And I think it's something to look at. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Ching. Mr. Ching.
Yeah, okay. Well, this social equity. See that I can give a realistic example, which you can look back in history. China and India in the last 20, 30 years, you see their growth rate. Okay, China grows at on average about 10% per year. India grow at 6% per year. What's the difference? Okay, somebody look at this difference. And Rob made this point, the gender. Chinese educate both the men and the women. India only educate the men. Okay, 6% versus 10%. Okay, so that's one point that countries which try to rise up should notice. It does make a difference, and also historically it gives us very solid evidence. And my professor, Professor C.V. Ramamurthy, suggests to me when he did not have chance to attend the Chinese, invite dinner to tell them that he proposed that we also educate the seniors, okay, like us here, seniors. Okay, he think this is a good idea. Okay, so this is just my starting point. But what I'm really trying to say is this. Okay, this topic of social and the equity, these are social science topics. Okay, science is value absent. Okay, and the social science, we do not feel that they have solved any problem with reliability. Okay, anytime there's a financial crisis, I'm the person who goes in and make a prediction. And the first one I didn't solve. The second one, subprime vote, I actually proposed several times just lower the interest rate as rapid as possible. Quantitative easing. And now you see, the printing of money become the solution to all the social problems today, which to me is they only take the easy part. They did not take the hard part. The hard part is you have to calculate. When you put out money, you need to know the rate of return. You cannot just dump money out and not care about the returns. So we're just going on a quantitative easing, method of solving social problems, and the result is inflation. Okay, now they try to solve the inflation, and they find that the only way to stop the inflation is to create another recession. You see, so this is, basically there's something wrong or something inadequate for today's society to support the people we have, the population we have. Okay, so again, I want to refer to some actual historical evidence. That is one of my mentor, Dr. K.T. Lee. He started Taiwan economic miracle. Okay, but that's not too unusual, because Japan, Korea, South Korea, and Singapore, Hong Kong all did the same. Okay, what they did was, you see, the old way is the farming. Long time ago, the farming is the only industry. Then we start to industrialize. Okay, in other words, all this Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, they all start to go into high tech. They raise the level, the society, what the society does in general. Okay, K.T. Lee invite every Chinese, overseas Chinese with technical background back to Taiwan to visit Taiwan. Some of them stayed. And because of their presence, Taiwan today capture one sector of the economy, one sector of the industry, the semiconductor industry. Okay, they are the leader in semiconductor fabrication. So this is the way. Then K.T. Lee used his experience. Actually, I started to talk to him, and also I introduced China to Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman gave a lecture to all the Chinese students. Instead, they tried to raise the cultural level of China. They went back and had this Tiananmen, student rebellion, and the student probably just want to have a social change, social revolution, rather than going to knowledge or cultural advancement. So what I'm saying is, K.T. Lee has given us one example of how a society can advance. Okay, today we're facing with another problem, similar problem. Okay, the high-tech industry is not sufficient for today's society. Okay, we're going to run out of energy. Okay, there's problem. Okay, you know, Dr. Sherry called me. I tell you, I'm debating with I'm engaging in some public debate and the private debate. What we talk about is how do we advance, raise the cultural level from today's high-tech culture to the next level. Okay, my suggestion as a founder of Pole Science is to go into social science, go into complete automation, life science. Okay, we need to raise this, but in order to raise this, we need knowledge. Where are the knowledge? Okay, Don and Rob, you point out we have some problem with all this, new economics, whatever they call it, The problem is, again, with Milton Friedman. He said that if we can get everybody to do business instead to fight, the world will be okay. So he has a dream of a money-oriented society. Everybody deal in money, okay? No more weaponry, no more military conflict. That is a dream, but that thing causes lots of problems, okay, today. Nobody is doing knowledge anymore, okay? People in the old days, all the scientists, they used to do science. Today, they all figure out, they play games, okay? They're applying game theory. Where can they get their contract, okay? Where can they get their money, okay? The target is money, no longer, it's all short-term monetary return. No more long-term social return. Okay, so that is the key problem. We need to go back to knowledge. Okay, we cannot focus on this money. This short-term, short-sighted view is causing most of the problem today. If you look at any problem today, you can see that behind it it's the money-oriented society. Okay. So what really needs to be done? We debate this almost every week. We have our people, publicly debate and private debate on this. Where shall we go? Okay. The first thing is no knowledge. Who's in? People are here. We're at the age we still know the knowledge-oriented people. Okay. But today you look at young people or the people who are rising up, who are billionaires. Okay, some of the names you mentioned are not equitable to the average people. These people are not interested in knowledge. Okay, for me, I look at them, I say, oh, this guy said no knowledge, and if I try to approach them, they're afraid to talk to me because they are not even qualified to be my student. I cannot even talk to them about knowledge. So basically, we're debating on this, and I'm forcing some organization, mainly people who are into knowledge-oriented organizations, to look at knowledge. At least there's some group that must still look at knowledge. Okay, so I'm looking at these groups, persuading them to go into to just promote knowledge, and we continue engaging in public debate. And it looks like my organization is sort of control most of the knowledge today because we are the people who are continuously doing knowledge. And we have gone from science to pole science. Now I'm summarizing all the knowledge. I'm dissociating myself from science completely. I used to call the organized pole science, but now I think I would call it universal permanent technology. In other words, today, science makes products that's either it's not universal, it's not permanent. Okay, you have a car which lasts for 5-10 years. You know, you don't expect to do something, expect to last forever. Okay, but the nature, when nature makes something, it's always designed for permanent existence. Okay, and that is based on complete automation. But that is a little bit far away from what we have today. What we have today is we need to, first of all, find a method to decide the social choices, which started mainly by three people, Kenneth Arrow, Gerald de Boer, and John von Neumann. They want to see the complete picture of deciding, social priorities. And I finished it by solving the problem of value. And using that, I predict the financial crisis, savings and loan, and the subprime vote. And that is the first step to, in other words, to be able to make rational decisions. Okay, the nature of this field is very different from today's social science. Okay, it requires mathematicians. It requires mathematical thinking of at least 50 variables. In the market, we are no longer deal with 5 variables. Force equal to M times M divided by R, and all this thing. It start to becomes order of magnitude, 50 variables versus 5 variables. So we need mathematicians, and we need to educate everybody, young and not young people. Young people need to get some knowledge. Okay, men, women, and the seniors. Okay, especially seniors. I think the seniors, some of the old, people I debate with seem to be, if they can still come out and change the industry into knowledge industry. Once we have a knowledge industry, I think the return will be extremely high. It's not like in science, because I mentioned once in this talk that 1 grain of seed is worth everything human being has created. Okay, another complete automation is so powerful. Okay, all the products in complete automation was much, much more than this, partially automated stuff. Today's software, who's going to maintain it? It will have a permanent maintenance cost, infinite maintenance cost. Okay, so there's what is needed is to raise the cultural level of society. Basically, cultural level is proportional to knowledge progress. So we need to progress from social science, from current science. Actually, science is quite high. Okay, it's knowledge. But in order to make money, they have lowered the cultural level to technology. In other words, today engineers are taking over. Okay, engineers, they cannot advance knowledge. They can make money. Okay. So we have this problem. Okay, the engineers in charge. We need scientists, we need mathematicians who can solve social science problems. We should continue this investment in knowledge. But it's all right, to make the world have more money, everybody can live a more comfortable life. That's okay. But the energy problem is getting to be, to surface up. That again require knowledge to solve. Okay, my training is in control fusion. So for 30, 40 years, nobody talk about control fusion. Now suddenly they feel they need energy. Now I fear that the nuclear energy will play a major part in the energy picture, because no other way can supply enough energy to support the need of today's people especially in the future. In the future, all this automation will make things electric. Okay, electric means energy. Okay, automation all needs
Thank you, sir.
electric. Okay. So okay, I guess
Thank you,
I
Mr.
need,
Ching. We have
go.
to
Okay.
move for a concluding remarks for today. Mr. Rob, yes, what's your concluding remarks for today's session? Mr. Rob.
Sure. So we're talking about equity. And there were a bunch of things that were brought up by Hugh and Donald. I kind of want to address through this. One of the problems we've got with regard to equity is that people don't want to give up power. There is a theory called argumentative theory that's worth reviewing that argues that the way that we developed was whoever won the argument became the most powerful person in the tribe. And so the focus became not who was right, but who could prevail in an argument. And argumentative theory probably goes to the core of many of the problems we have as a society, because the people that are winning the arguments aren't right. They're just very good at debating and arguing, or keeping the other people from voicing their views. And that goes contrary to equity. You can't fix a problem with equity if the people that you're trying to make equitable value power above all else and value winning an argument over being correct in an argument, which is problematic. And I think Donald certainly alluded to a lot of that in current politics in the United States. People, to a large extent, at least from a historical perspective, don't want equity. They want equity if they're being disenfranchised or devalued. But if they're the ones that have the power, they don't want to give up that power. And they're the ones that have to vote. So that makes it so that the society, by and large, doesn't seem to want equity, and it's how we're brought up, how we're trained, and argument theory suggests it's how we're wired, which means very hard to overcome. Donald brought up measuring your happiness, and this is actually an interesting idea because it fascinates me. The happiest countries tend to be countries that are in really lousy places to live. But really has less to do about the environment, more to do about how the people are treated. And Finland is constantly brought up, the Scandinavian countries in general, and Finland in particular, as a place where people are surprisingly happy. Even though the weather there is such that you wouldn't think they would be. I think it just shows that the focus on creating equity can have a very positive impact on the quality of lives. Hugh brought up the disparity between China and India, which I thought was fascinating. I hadn't actually thought of that myself. That if you can create equity, you can actually improve productivity, and that's an excellent point. If you're devaluing a large section of your workforce, be it because of their skin color or because of their sex, you're not going to be as performant as a country that isn't doing that. That you just have more capable people that are able to do things. And excuse the phone. So that this underlying concept of cognitive dissonance, the allowing people to see things that violate their worldview and accept them as opposed to hide from them. Over the last weekend, I saw the Barbie movie, and if you get a chance, it's not really a movie about dolls. It's a movie about cognitive dissonance and the handling of cognitive dissonance. And if you sit back and watch the movie, and that's why I think it's been so popular, is it forces you to think about things you probably aren't comfortable thinking about. And clearly the character has that same kind of aha moment. It's really not a movie for kids; it's a movie for adults. But if you can understand cognitive dissonance, then you can understand how to challenge your beliefs and recognize that when you feel uncomfortable about a belief that challenges your views, that's a good thing. That you want more of that because it expands your worldview, and it allows you to think of things in a broad and inclusive way, as opposed to being very narrowly focused and having other people dictate what it is you view, which I think is problematic. Donald said something I want to modify. He mentioned that CEOs are measured on salary. That's not necessarily true. They're measured against each other. They measure themselves on salary, but they're actually measured on performance. And I think that speaks to why so many CEOs get fired. And I've been very active in getting a number of them fired over the years. Because when you give a CEO a large salary, it has no positive impact on the performance. In fact, in many cases, has a negative impact on the performance. It gives them enough money to do whatever it is they want to do, And that becomes a massive distraction. Now they can hire attorneys. They can do a lot of things that allow them to do things that as a lower level employee that they wouldn't be allowed to do. And my experience is the higher you go in the company, the more likely you're to think the policies don't apply to you, which is horrible for governance. And so this disparity between how CEOs measure themselves against each other in terms of salary and how they're actually measured, which is performance, I think speaks to why so many of them fail. They focus on the wrong aspect of their performance review. They think the salary is absolute, and that with that kind of money they can do anything. I'm looking to Mark Hurd, who's now passed, so I can refer to him, was a guy that just kind of didn't quite get it. He actually was very performant, but the salary got in the way, and the reason he was fired is he decided to hire himself a work wife, which was absolutely not approved in a company like Hewlett Packard, and so that got him fired. But he thought there was no problem with it. In fact, his buddy over at Oracle, Larry Ellison, was the one that convinced him to go down that path, and Larry was able to make it work. Mark Hurd, not so much. So that disparity between salary and performance is something that we want to make companies better. Is something that we ought to fix. Don also pointed out Harvard as a problem, and I think the part we miss with regard to Harvard is, and I agree with him, that the people that come out of Harvard are they have the degree, but they haven't really proven themselves, especially not in politics, to being all that brilliant. But what Harvard gives you is context. It gives you, it's not what you know, it's who you know kinds of inroads. And Harvard folks stick together. It's kind of a large scale clique. And so it can equate to success, but it doesn't necessarily equate to individual capability, which is problematic. It really should be a case when you come out of school, the measurements you get equate to what you can do, not just who you know. In fact, ideally, it would be both. You would come out performant and you would come out well-known. Harvard tends to pivot too hard onto the who you know side, and that's why so many of the folks that come out of Harvard, in my view, are not performant at all. They're not even capable of doing the job they're doing. The trying to get to this idea of equity is problematic, and I guess that's where I want to close. It goes back to the fact you have to overcome societal norms. You have to accept cognitive dissonance, and you have to understand that people are people, and you have to work within that construct and really kind of deprogramming them against the idea that power is absolute and going after power in and of itself in a pure sense, or after wealth in itself in a pure sense. It's not only not good for society, it's not good for you individually. And so taking people back to this idea that Don came up with as far as being happy, if we could just come up with a definition and a focus early on in kids' lives to focus on what is it that you enjoy doing, what is it that you want to do, and then craft a mobile career path, because they're going to change as they age. So that you emphasize flexibility, you emphasize the ability to pivot, you break the constructs that say you have to be this way. I was looking at a cartoon and had a bunch of animals lined up, and it said, okay, we're going to treat you all equally. And it came back and says, and so all these animals are geniuses, but if you ask the fish to climb a tree, it's going to grow up thinking it's an idiot, because you made that goal it could not achieve. That you have to avoid that kind of problem, and to do that, you have to understand the student, you have to understand the individual, and you have to focus on optimizing the individual against societal constructs, not in absolutes. The society doesn't dictate what the individual does, and the individual doesn't dictate what society does. It has to have a balance, and that balance has to focus back on what would make the individual and happy, content, self-actualized. You want to drop into Maslow. But that's where I think education lets us down. We do not teach the kids how to reach a point where they even understand what would make them happy. It wouldn't be buying things, wouldn't be getting married. It really would be based on their own unique needs, their own unique desires, and their unique advantages. For instance, you take a gay child and you convince them they're going to be happy in a heterosexual marriage. That's not going to work. And I'm not suggesting we turn all kids gay either. That's a whole different dynamic. But the fact is if you don't understand the child, if you don't understand the adult, you can't direct them in a way that will help them be happy. And if they don't understand themselves, they're of no help. So fixing that underlying problem, I think, would be a great way to solve long term the society and equity problem, rather than trying band-aid approaches. I mean, and going back to the Barbie movie, and then I'll end. The Barbie movie, what it showcased in cognitive dissonance was as Barbie goes through her experience, her first decision when she finds out that things are different than how she thought they were, was to return to the way she was. In other words, disavow the knowledge, go back to the world where she was happy, where she did not have to deal with this cognitive, with these differences, with this conflict in her worldview. And then eventually, as the movie resolves, she realizes she has to absorb those items to become a better person. In the end, at least you get the sense she's happier. That's artificial construct, granted it's scripted. But I believe that outcome is true, in that if you better understand yourself, you better understand how you interrelate with society, you better understand what makes you happy and what makes you miserable, then you can craft a life that focuses on the former and moves away from the latter, and you'll be overall more successful as a human. And that should be our goal. It shouldn't be to be Bill Gates. I know Bill, he's a happy guy, but it should be it's good for him. It wouldn't be good for most of us. And the final thing to think about is when somebody finally wins a lottery or whatever, the story we don't tell is how that destroys their lives. And that should never happen. If people understood what made them happy, if people understood their place in life, if you gave them a bunch of money, that wouldn't break them. But if you give a person a bunch of money all at once, it more often than not, it destroys them. And it's because they don't have that foundation. They don't have that foundation to build upon to move forward. And as a result, they fail, and we as a society fail. And now I'll pass that.
Thank you, Mr. Donald. What's your concluding remarks? Then Mr. Maimon.
Well, I want to mention something that Hugh said about social science. And I forget who said it. It was one of the heads of the Federal Reserve, but he said that he pointed out that in physics, molecules do the same thing all the time. And so we can't possibly predict the weather a month in the future. And we can to some degree, but we can't accurately predict it. But human beings are looking at what other people are doing, thinking about their own future, being contrary just for the sake of it, and all these kinds of things. And we're all interacting with each other. So it makes what humans do even more complex than what molecules do. Sociology is one of the more complex fields of study. However, there are things that we can do that turn it into a more measurable thing. And one of them is social networks are a good way of describing social structure. And there was a book that was an extreme breakthrough that came in the early 60s, late 50s, called Chains of Opportunity, where a group of students were a research project led by Harrison White, who is actually one of my mentors. I'm a co-author of a book with him, a minor co-author. He has many co-authors. And but what he did is he studied how people rose in organizations. And the original theory was that people with better backgrounds, the ones that went to Harvard and came from rich families, and tried to show how merit and experience and these kinds of things were the drivers for people rising in organizations. And they could not do it. They tried forever. And finally, this one student, Michael Schwartz, Michael told me this, he was coding these laborious, awful tasks of coding how people rose in organizations for various organizations. And Harrison told him, he was on work study. So Harrison told him, well, I'm merciful. There's books here in my office. You can just read sometimes and just forget about the coding. And so he pulled out a book on stochastic processes, which is random processes, especially related to lines and queues and things like that. And it just hit him. and he recoded everything with basically saying that people rose in organizations pretty much randomly, and that being in the right place at the right time was a far, far, far better predictor of what causes people to rise in organizations than any particular merit or skill that they have. Sadly, in organizations, there's another book, I can't remember its name right now, where he analyzed CEOs, and he showed that CEOs that were really financially successful coincided with when the economy was doing very well. And so the same CEO, they'll hire him for $100 million a year, her for $100 million a year, and she'll take over a new company and do terrible. But that's because she took it over during a time when we were having a recession and the economy wasn't doing well. And that basically the CEO had very, very little to do with a company's performance. So I don't believe that I think it's organizations are kidding themselves when they think that they're doing performance-based judging people and promoting on a performance base. But that's a discussion Rob and I can have. It's an amusing discussion, and it's fun. I wouldn't stake my life on it in any way. It's amusing, but what I'm
Donald, we should do that at some future point. Actually have that. I think it'd be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, it'd be fun. And so where I'm really going to conclude with is back to what I'm saying is that it's an underlying attitude. The only way that we're going to have more equity in society is that people are going to want more equity in society. So the history of Finland was that at the same time, basically Swedish people owned the most land in Finland, and so Finns themselves were relegated to being second-class citizens in their own country. And in 1917, there was a revolution, and the Finns rose up and fought the Swedes, and basically it was a terrible civil war. There was concentration camps and, just a horrible thing. This was 1917, the same year as the Russian Revolution. And after it was all over, they got together and they said, what can we do so this doesn't happen again? And they heavily invest in the society, and Finns believe that if other people are better off, they're better off, because they live in a world with other people. We can't do anything by ourselves. We can't grow our own food and make our own computers and all the kinds of things that we need. That's ridiculous. I mean, even with a computer, each part of it, the software and the hardware, are made by people with incredibly different skill sets that don't even understand what each other's do. I know that very well because I taught in corporations for years. And in Finland, it kind of goes with something Rob said. In Finland, they start teaching people how to work as a community in communal ways. Montessori schools do that in the United States. So if people are taught and grow up with that view and that idea, then there's a lot of ways that you can structure things, but people have to want to do it. And so I recommend that every person try to, and Rob said something about it, that it happens within the person. So I recommend every person really start thinking seriously about how much you're really an individual. I ask my students sometimes, I say, name 3 things that are important and valuable in life that you don't get from other people. And, most people never thought of it. And when I say it to a class of 30 people, they just short out because you can't. And so it's acknowledging and understanding the value of equity is the key. And each of us can learn more about that and incorporate that as part of our life. And if you do, you'll find you're luckier, you do better in work, your health will be better. There's a huge amount of advantages to it that have actually been studied and researched
Thank you.
and have empirical evidence.
Thank you.
That's what I want to say.
Thank you. Mr. Maimun, what's your concluding remarks for today? Thank you.
Thank you. I
Mr.
joined in
Maimun
late, so
Mustafa.
apologies. Hi, am I audible? Perfect. Firstly, thank you to Rob, Hugh, and Donald for your amazing presentations today. I'm gonna keep it short. I know we're pressed for time. So, one of my favorite books is Animal Farm. When I read it in high school, it was a pain. I don't understand why we were talking about animals that could speak to one another and drive someone out of a farmhouse. But it is not only for socialism, even though George Orwell wrote it for that. I think in capitalism, we see the same things. It's always old wine in a new bottle. Whoever you put at the top of the chain, they're always going to be reacting in the same way. Unfortunately, that greed versus the idea of a gain is a good motivator. But greed definitely, somehow instilled in the human psyche. So, coming from a developing country perspective, in a world where the SDGs still can't ensure housing, education, food, and clothing for everybody, it's something that we really need to think about. That if we can ensure the basics, what's happening? I picked up from a few points from Rob about where he talked about Harvard University and a former trustee of a local university over here. His kids went to Ivies. And he said, listen, the only reason you go to is the same reason that Rob just mentioned, that you go for the connections, right? It's the alumni network. The Ivies stick with the other top universities, with Oxbridge, and these people just pull each other up. It's the same thing in Bangladesh. If you go to a top university, your alumni network will basically pull you up more than your effective skill. So that's my second point. I think I want to pick up on education. To empower individuals, we need to have three things. One is knowledge, one is education, and of course, skills. So education I'm going to refer to as the basic certification. But in the world of today, I don't think that certificate really matters. What it matters is skill, because that leads to people earning an income. I understand that income isn't everything, but again, from a developing perspective, the people in power don't want you to question, because the 5% control the 95%. And that's a world that I think we don't need to be in. And it's interesting that we talk about Barbie. I just came from that show. This concept was explored in the 2000s by the same movie called Matrix, right? Do you want to have the blue pill or do you want to have the red pill? People don't usually want to have the red pill. There was one character that sabotaged the proponents in the movie by saying that, hey, I want to go back to being blind. I want to go back to the area of being in cognitive dissonance, because I'd rather have that cheesy French piece burger than live in a world where people are tattered and continuously chased by robots, right? So, again, I don't want to go into the demonology of it because we are, again, pressed for time. But what that shows is, in the world of TikTok, of Facebook, where influencers are just looking for likes, and they're making incomes just being popular. I mean, there isn't real value in that. And if the whole point of your life is just to get likes, it's just to get that online presence and you having an image, it's very, very interesting. Again, I'll just conclude with another movie reference. It was an Indian movie that I saw the other day, and it's about this high school teacher who basically thinks about his image. He lies to everyone in his town that he's this, he's that, and he basically neglects his wife because she has epilepsy, because it again ruins his image. So I think this image that we think about is what we need to think about in society and equity. That what do we want in life? Like, what makes us happy? Is that image what really makes you happy, or are there real things like being with family, like being with a good and impactful job, like contributing to society? Are these the real things that matter, or is it that Mercedes car or that Louis Vuitton bag that you need to buy next? So with those thoughts, I'll leave for today. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.